Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2019 Downing Lecture at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics. I would like to begin the evening by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the land on which tonight's lecture takes place. As Dean of the Faculty, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you here to this public event. It is great to see so many of you here for what will absolutely be a fascinating lecture. A special welcome to all our Business and Economics board members and Alumni Council members who are here this evening, including Lord Mayor Sally Capp and Chair of the Board, Dr. Peter Yates. The Downing Lecture takes place each year in honor of Professor Richard Downing, who was the Ritchie Professor of Research in Economics at the University of Melbourne from 1954 until his sudden death in 1975. In this position, he made a significant contribution to economic research and did much to guide and foster the research interests of students and staff. He played a prominent role in founding the Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, which today co-hosts this lecture jointly with the Department of Economics. We are truly honored to have members of the Downing family here this evening. Welcome to you. Unfortunately, Richard's wife, Jean, was not able to join us this evening. Jean and Richard shared a deep commitment to supporting initiatives at the university, and Jean has been an important supporter of social work at the University of Melbourne. We thank her for her ongoing support, including her commitment to this annual Downing Lecture. With the Downing family, we honor the achievements and the memory of Professor Downing by gathering each year to hear from great economists from around the world. To introduce tonight's speaker, I would now like to welcome Professor Abigail Payne, Director, and Ronald Henderson Chair at the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economic and Social Research. Abigail.
Thank you, Paul. I too would like to pay my respects to the elders of the traditional lands on which we are gathered, past and present, and the elders of other communities who may be here today. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor David Autor as tonight's Downing Lecture speaker. Professor Autor is a Ford Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. By the end of tonight, I think you will see how Professor Autor emulates the legacy of Professor Downing. Core to Downing's interest and activities was a keenness to promote social welfare, primarily through public policy, whether it be through the tax system, superannuation, public service provision, or through education. He was a strong advocate of promoting equity while advancing economic growth. On his death in 1975, Professor Downing was referred to as one of the founders of the welfare state in Australia. Just last month, the magazine The Economist referred to David as the academic voice of the American worker. This sounds very fitting for a Downing Lecture speaker. Sorry, I have done my research on David. David has been enormously influential in economics, and yet his path into this field was far from direct. Like Bill Gates, he initially dropped out of university and ended up working in various technology-related jobs. After a few years, he returned to university and received a bachelor's degree in psychology. But this degree did not lead him to graduate school. Instead, he took on a job in San Francisco to teach disadvantaged children computer programming skills. It was 3 years later that he went back to school to pursue a public policy degree at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it was there that he discovered economics, and he went on to receive his PhD. His first and current job was and is at MIT. His work has included such important issues as understanding how technology disruption affects labor markets, the economic effects of automation, and an explanation for the China shock, the role of wages in measuring inequality, and peer effects in education, the role of finance in university completion, and much, much more. In academics, we often look at citation counts as a measure of impact. So I thought I would look at David's, as well as one of his classmates, both having received their PhD in 1999. His classmate has an impressive 9,000 citations. If 9,000 is impressive, what do you think if I told you that David is just shy of 40,000 citations? David has given his time and advice to inform and shape economic policy. He is highly regarded inside and outside of academia. While the current U.S. president may not be phoning him, he has answered the phone to discuss economic issues with other presidents. David's accolades and service to the profession are numerous. I could be here all night naming them. Instead, let's get on with the lecture. Please join me in welcoming David Autor.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their ancestors and subsequent generations. It's an honor to be here tonight. Thank you for welcoming me to this wonderful country. This is the first time I've been here, and I hope to be back again. I want to talk today about changes in the nature of work, and I want to relate them to four subjects. Overall changes in inequality, changes in the type of work people do, changes in where they do that work, how that relates to the age structure of population, and finally, trying to look forward at the work that is ahead. I'm going to present only US data. I apologize, I do not have companion slides for Australia, hopefully on my next visit. So let me leap right in. As many of you will be aware, there has been an enormous growth of the inequality of earnings in the US and in many advanced countries, not as much in Australia, although it actually has occurred. And this figure shows you that by plotting the growth of real earnings for 5 education groups. High school dropouts, high school graduates, those with some college, those with a 4-year college degree, and those with post-baccalaureate education. The panel on the left is for men, the panel on the right is for women. There are a number of things to notice about this, but let me draw your attention to 2 of them. One is the very rapid, steep, ongoing rise of real earnings of people with college and post-college education. The other is the falling real earnings of people with high school or lower education. The first one, the rising earnings of highly educated people, is actually not that hard to understand or rationalize. In a world that's increasingly automated, in a world that's increasingly information and expertise intensive, we've experienced rising demand for education, for human capital for at least a century. And as that demand has risen, earnings have risen for highly educated people, and we've produced a lot more highly educated people in response to that. Education has risen dramatically in the last century, but especially since the Second World War. And you can see that in this figure, which shows you, for the US workforce, the fraction of all hours supplied by education group. So in 1963, for example, about 75% of all hours worked were by people with high school or lower education. By 2017, that was only a third. Similarly, in 1963, around 12% of all workers had college or higher education. At present, it's 40%. So we've seen rapid growth in demand for high-skilled workers. We've seen rapid increase in the supply of education. The demand for highly educated workers has moved out even faster than the supply, and that's tended to push up their wages. More surprising is the falling real wages of the less educated. And I'm just putting these against one another. That's actually much harder to understand. Why is that hard to understand? Well, so one thing is they're becoming scarcer. There are fewer of them. Usually when something becomes scarcer, its price rises. In addition, sort of canonical models that economists use to understand wage setting suggest that high and low-skilled labor, college and non-college labor, will be complements, just like capital and labor are complements. So as we get more highly educated workers, they become more productive, that should actually create benefits for the less educated as well. That should raise their wages simultaneously, and that has not occurred. That's a puzzle. I'm going to, and I should say I'm not the first to notice this puzzle. There's lots of explanations that have been given having to do with changes in minimum wages, changes in the structure of unions, changes in norms, changes in trade. All of these factors are important. I'm going to focus on one, which I think is especially relevant, and that is changes in the type of work that people do. So I'm going to turn your attention to occupations now. And I'm going to break the world up into roughly 3 broad categories of occupations. On the left-hand side of this figure, in orange, are what you would call primarily service occupations, occupations that involve helping, caring for, or assisting others. They are typically low-paid occupations, and they are growing rapidly in the US and in many advanced economies. So some examples would be, food service, cleaning, home health aides, security, entertainment, recreation, some degree transportation, repair as well. And a characteristic of these jobs is they don't typically require high formal levels of education, and they don't also require a lot of formal training. So many people can be productive at that type of work right away. And in addition, you don't typically have rising wages over the career in many of those types of work because you're not building specialized skills. And in fact, you're not necessarily economically very secure because the next person who wants a job might be just as good at it as you are because there isn't a big return to experience if you're serving food or if you're working in security or cleaning and so on. So those jobs are growing rapidly in the United States, throughout the OECD. In the middle are production, office administrative support, and sales. These are middle skill, middle wage jobs. They're done by a mixture of people with college and no college degree. And distinct from these service occupations, they have fairly specialized knowledge bases. And most people, when they do them, after a while, they get much better at them. If you're working in a factory, you learn how to make the thing you're supposed to make. If you're working in an office, you learn how to work with the people that you're jointly producing with. And those jobs are higher paid, typically in the services, and they are contracting rapidly. You can see that. On the far right, in red, are professional, technical, and managerial jobs. These are college-educated jobs. They're the types of jobs that all of you have or hope to have, and they're well paid. They have a lot of security. There's a lot of expertise and skill building. They're also a lot of fun. So this barbell shape that you see in this figure, with sort of increasing poundage on either end of the bar, is the source of that is not mysterious. We pretty well understand that what's happening in these middle categories is that the process of automation, especially information technology, has made it easy to codify the tasks that is done in that work. Many of those jobs follow explicit procedures, whether it's a repetitive motion procedure in a factory or whether it's a repetitive cognitive activity like sorting or copying or filing or typing or calculating. Many of those things are increasingly done by machines. That has reduced demand for labor in those activities. And meanwhile, on the right-hand side, these professional, technical, and managerial jobs, many of them have actually really benefited from computerization because they use information technology as an input. It's made people, if you're a researcher, if you're an attorney, if you're in marketing, if you're in a creative profession, having access to tons of cheap processing power and information makes you more effective at what you do. Then on the far left, many of those service occupations, although they don't require high levels of formal skills, they require dexterity, flexibility, common sense, use of interactive language. And so even though they're not highly skilled by human standards, they're very hard to automate. And so automation has actually had the effect of pushing downward the middle and pushing out the two ends. So some would call this employment polarization. Okay, so now I'm gonna step back and sort of collapse these 9 bars into 3. So I'm going to show you the growth between 1970 and 2016 of these low, middle, and high skill occupations in the United States. And when I do it that way, you can see, most of what's happening is the middle is contracting and the upper part is rising, which seems like pretty good news, right? This is like, the middle class is shrinking. Oh no, oh wait, they're becoming upper class. Okay, that's fine. So not so worrisome. Now I'm going to break that down one more time. I'm going to split it by education groups. I'm going to split it into college and non-college workers. So let me define terms. For purposes of this talk, college workers are those with a beyond high school education, some college, college degree, post-college education. Non-college means high school or below, high school or high school dropout or high school non-completion. When I do it that way, what you can see very clearly is among college-educated workers, most of the decline in the middle has been accommodated by growth at the top. So that they've moved out of middle skill occupations and into traditionally high-wage, high-skill occupations. For non-college workers, just the opposite has occurred. Right? Non-college workers have moved out of production and office work and into services, into food service, into cleaning, into security, into entertainment, into recreation, into home health care. That's an important force, potentially, that tells us how work is changing. But now I want to link that to three other phenomena. So I want to show you, I've shown you these changes in occupations. I now want to link them to the changing geography of work. And this polarization that I've just dramatized, or at least maybe drama is too strong a word, that I've just documented, is not, as it turns out, a kind of a uniform phenomenon occurring evenly across space. Rather, it's going to turn out that this is very much a phenomenon of urban labor markets, of dense locations where there used to be a lot of middle skill work and there no longer is. And so I want to show you how work has changed pictorially across places. Then I want to link that to changes in wages across places. And and then finally changes in who lives where, partly in response to those factors. So let me start off. The changing geography of work. Excuse me. So I'm going to put up a bunch of figures that look like this. So let me define what I'm doing here. On the x-axis here is population density of US commuting zones, which are labor markets, about 722 of them. This is a logarithmic scale, so as we go in each increment, gets 10 times as dense. So on the far left, you're going to see those will be rural areas, then suburbs, then metro areas, then cities. This shows you the fraction of residents who are college educated. So in 1950, you can see that on average, somewhere between 5 and 10% of US adults had a 4-year college degree. And that gap between the densest cities and the most rural areas was about 5 percentage points, so small. Roll the clock forward to 1970, that's still about 5 percentage points, that gap. The locus shifts up, but there's no tilt. If we go to 1980, that gap increases to about 8 percentage points, then 13, then 17, then 20 percentage points. Okay? So over the course of 65 years, the fraction of people who have a college degree has increased by about 4-fold, but that has become extremely unequally distributed across places. Cities have become much, much more educated. Now, it's not that everyone who was born in a city goes on for higher education and people who are not born in a city don't go on for higher education. A lot of this is going to reflect mobility, people moving across places. And then come back to this topic of why high educated people are moving to cities. Okay. So that's the skill mix. Now I want to show you how jobs are laid out across places. So I'm going to focus on non-college workers initially. And again, I'm going to break them into these 3 occupation categories. The service occupations, traditionally low wage, these middle skill, production, clerical, admin support, and sales, and then high skill, professional, technical, and managerial. So what this shows you, and this is in 1970, that if you were a non-college worker and you were living in a rural area, we would expect that you would be doing manual labor or service work. However, if you were living in an urban area, you'd be substantially more likely to be doing middle skill work, to be doing production work, or to be doing office clerical work. You'd be no more likely, however, to be doing traditionally high skill work, right? So you could say, as you moved out of rural areas and into urban areas, you kind of climb this occupation gradient, right? From doing physical work to doing more cognitively intensive work, more specialized work, okay? So now that's 1970. I'm going to roll the clock forward a decade. This is 1980. And you can see a little bit of shifting, but not much. Those lines are pretty much right on top of each other. I'm going to add another decade's data, 1990. And now you can see this rotation, right, in the middle. That green line is below the red and blue. In other words, the prevalence of middle skill work among non-college workers in cities is falling. And they're not moving into high skill work, right? So clearly they're moving into these services, into traditionally lower paid work. Now I'm going to add the year 2000. You can see that rotation occurs even further. And then 2015. So by 2015, the whole chart has moved downward, but there's no longer any slope. In other words, broadly speaking, the set of jobs that non-college workers do in cities are no different in 2015 than is the set of jobs that they're doing outside of cities, which is very different from the period 45 years earlier, right? So there's just been what you can see as a kind of a polarization or a hollowing out, right? Where traditionally, historically, in the post-war period, in cities, less educated people did a distinct type of work, and that is completely gone. That distinction is no longer there. So you might ask, well, has the same thing happened among college-educated workers? So let me show you the figure. So here's 1970. So you can see, first of all, there isn't that much of a gradient across places. And if I add a couple more decades, you can see very little has changed, okay? So what this says is, in broad terms, looking at this very high level of occupations, when we think about, how has work changed, we often think, among educated people, we have this sort of conceit that our work has been transformed by technology. We are so advanced, we do a different set of things. The truth is nothing like that. Technology has changed the tools that we use to do our jobs, but it actually hasn't changed our jobs much. So we don't any longer use pencil and paper, we use monitors, we use printers, but fundamentally we're doing the same work with a different set of tools. When we think about less educated adults, they're doing different work. It's not that they're using new tools to do the old work, it's that the old work, a lot of it has largely been eliminated. What is or what was that old work? Well, in simplest terms, it really is two broad categories. It was production work and it was office work. So production work, historically, manufacturing took place in cities. The reason manufacturing was in cities is because cities historically had access to waterways for transportation, they had access to rails, they were the earliest places to have electrification. So manufacturing took place in cities because that's where the infrastructure was that was needed for manufacturing. Manufacturing has been fleeing cities for a century, trying to move out. But even as of 1970, this blue locus shows you that in mid-sized US cities, there was still a lot of production work. But of course, when you look from 1970 to 1990, you can see that blue series is sort of shifting downward. And by 2015, there's just not much production work remaining. That's a function of several things, one of them being technological change, the other being foreign competition. Certainly China's rise had a very large impact on US manufacturing in the 2000s. If we look at the red line, which is administrative and clerical work, that was a very large chunk of employment for non-college women and for college-educated women. So, for example, in 1970, among non-college educated women who were working in New York City, 50% of them were doing office clerical work. And now you can see the whole level has fallen and there's no longer any urban gradient. Right? So what this says is that there's been a tremendous change in the structure of the type of work for less educated adults, but it's not occurring everywhere. It's more that there was something distinctive about cities. There was something special that went on there where less educated adults did more specialized work, and that has gone away. Okay? All right. So I could show you in greater detail for different groups, but let me not do that. I will also mention, worth mentioning, U.S. cities are much more diverse than they used to be. So this shows you the fraction of adults by population density who are foreign-born. And you can see, in 1970, even in the densest cities, no more than 25% of citizens were foreign-born. By 2015, more than half of people without a college degree and about 40% of those with a college degree in big US cities are foreign-born. And the foreign-born, they actually have a fairly bimodal distribution of education. They're more likely to have a PhD than the average American, and they're more likely to not have completed high school than the average American. Not the same person, obviously. I will just summarize by saying this is not an artifact of the ethnic structure of cities. This pattern of polarization that I showed you you would find it among among native-born as well as foreign-born. So I'll just cut to the chase and skip that slide. Okay, so now I've shown you how the structure of work has changed across places. But you may be saying, who cares, right? Work is work. What we care about is earnings. If they're working, is it really such a big deal what job they do? And of course, you're already saying, I hope you're already saying, well, it matters actually what people do. People care about the type of work they do. It isn't purely just their earnings. They have pride in their work. Work is not just about money. It's about identity. It's about a social structure. It's about your standing. You can take satisfaction in the work you do, or you can feel that your work is not esteemed, not meaningful. So I think it matters even if it didn't relate to wages. But of course, I'm going to show you information on wages. I'm an economist, right? Okay, so I want to show you the relationship between population density and the earnings levels of college and non-college workers. So let me, again, define terms. So as before, as with all slides you've seen, I'm showing you the population density is the same set of locations. The y-axis here is the natural logarithm of wages, so it's a proportional scale. So an increment of 0.1 is a 10% increase. And the blue series refers to college workers, meaning with people with beyond high school education, and the red series refers to non-college workers. So what you can see is if you look at 1970, the far left panel, you'll see that wages are much higher in cities than they are in other areas, right? So wages are steeply increasing in population density, and they're increasing for both college and non-college workers. In other words, wages are much higher in cities than they are in rural areas, but wage inequality, the difference between the earnings of highly educated and less educated actually does not vary across places. So you might say, well, why are wages higher in dense places? Well, you could give a couple of explanations. One is to say, well, those are expensive places to live. So people have to be compensated to live there. They have to, cover their cost of housing and so on. But that's not a sufficient answer because employers have to want to pay people to be there. It must be that those places are in some sense more productive. And there's lots of evidence and lots of historical thinking on this question. And it does appear that cities are places that typically are more productive. They're more innovative. There's more new ideas. There's more, and there's more. People are getting more out of the investments they make, possibly because when you have lots of people together, they're able to share ideas. They're able to create, and so you have what you would call these kind of virtuous complementarities. And this is especially true for the educated. Right? So we know that historically cities have been more educated, presumably because the type of work that educated people do benefits from proximity, right? Benefits from being in the same place and sharing ideas or moving quickly among jobs, among specialized employers, or even if you're going to have specialized skills, you need to be in a city where there is a market for such things. So it's easy to understand why wages are higher for the highly educated in cities because they're more productive there. So an interesting question is, well, why are they also higher for less educated workers, for non-college workers? And there, I'm going to speculate that it's because the type of work they were doing in cities had to be done with the educated, right? So if you were a manufacturing worker, maybe what you would do if the factory were outside of a city and inside the city is the same, but you have to be where the supervisor is, right, where the factory worker is. So you're jointly producing with them. Similarly, if you're an office worker, maybe office work isn't more productive in Manhattan than it would be, in some less busy place. But of course, that's where the professionals were. That's where the idea generation was going on, and so you needed to be there, jointly producing with them. So you could say in that time, non-college workers were doing specialized work, and they were working jointly with more specialized workers to produce stuff, right? Whether it was producing goods, whether it was producing services in offices. But as time has gone on, as we know, those middle skill jobs have hollowed out, have gone away. And increasingly, although there are non-college workers working in cities, the work that they do is really quite distinct and disconnected from what is being done by the highly educated. Right? So to a very large extent in cities, the job of less educated adults is to see to the care and the comfort and the health of the more affluent. Right? And so that kind of virtuous interaction is probably a lot less prevalent, that sort of joint production. So if so, you might expect then that the benefits, the wage premium that comes with being in urban areas for the less educated would perhaps decline over time. And in fact, that's what you see in this figure. So if you look at the blue series first, the more educated, you can see that it kind of lifts and rotates counterclockwise. So over time, that blue locus is becoming steeper as seemingly the premium to being in an urban area is potentially rising for the highly educated. If you look at the red line, it's going in just the opposite direction. It's rotating clockwise. So, if you look here or look back in 1970, it was extremely steep for non-college workers. By 1980, that's less visible. By 2000, you can see it rotate further. And by 2015, it's almost gone, right? So it's not that less educated adults in cities don't make somewhat more, but the steepness of that premium has substantially declined. And that's true, by the way, if you look at young adults, 25 to 39. If you look at people 40 to 54, you see the same figure. You could also, by the way, look in a little more detail. So you might see saying, those are pretty broad education categories. Can we break that down? And of course, the answer is yes. So this shows you for 5 education groups: high school dropouts, high school grad, some college grad, greater than college. And what you see is that for people with high school or below, we're rotating clockwise. For people with college or above, we're rotating anti-clockwise. And so it does appear that the kind of wage gains that the less educated would get as they move into cities are declining. So I think it's a really kind of important set of background facts, something I was not very well aware of until I started working on this some months ago. And I think these two things are linked. These changes in occupational structure and these changes in wages reflect the changing nature of work. And I think many of us have in mind that cities are lands of opportunity. That's where you go to move up the economic ladder. And no question that is true for highly educated adults, right? It's never been a better time to be in a city because wages are so high. There's so much great work. However, work for less educated citizens is arguably becoming more generic, right? And the benefits they might expect to receive by moving to a city may actually be falling. So now let me relate this to a third force, which is where people are choosing to live, right? So I've already showed you that cities have become much more educated, right? That they were just a little more educated than rural areas in the 1950s. By 2010, much more educated. So now I want to look at the age structure of cities and other places. And we know that as places become more educated, they actually will tend to become a bit younger because the most recent cohorts are the best educated. So if education is rising generation over generation, then if a place becomes educated rapidly, it probably means that young, highly educated people are moving in. So let me show you that in terms of just overall age. This shows you the age structure of US counties. So these are smaller units than cities, but the same idea. And you see what I think is a striking pattern. So in 1950, this is the median age. In 1950, rural areas were at the median about 5 years younger than urban areas. Right? So as you would move out of cities, people would actually get younger, which I guess is a good reason to move out of cities. Then by 1970, that actually changes shape. The places that are getting younger actually are places in the middle, very likely because people are moving to the suburbs. Right? Then in 1990, that relationship is not as clear, but it's gone up, everything's moved up, and that's because the population is aging, right? The large baby boom cohorts are now, entering middle age, fertility has fallen, so everyone's getting older. And then finally look forward to 2010, and you can see that entire relationship has reversed, right? So now as you move from rural areas into urban areas, the population is actually getting younger. So between 1950 and 2010, US rural areas aged by about 12 years and cities aged by only 2 years. So, which is really a remarkable change. And so what it says is cities, so now you have kind of 3 facts, or well, you have many, many facts, but 3 new facts, hopefully, is that, over the last 40 years, the structure of urban areas has changed, right? Middle skill work has gone away, and it's become much more polarized. They become much more educated. Wages have risen for the highly educated and fallen in relative terms for the less educated, and they've gotten much younger, right? Cities have gotten much younger. And now I'm only presenting data for the United States. I don't know if this pattern is true for many other countries, but I strongly suspect it is. I strongly suspect it is. So how did that happen? How did cities get younger? As those of you who study demography know, there's only 4 ways this can occur. One is that there's a differential change in fertility. We have more babies being born in cities, for example. That would tend to make them younger. A second would be a differential change in mortality. If mortality were to rise in cities, given that mortality is generally concentrated among older adults, that would tend to make them younger. The cities, that is. The third is mobility, right? People moving across places. So it could be that younger people are moving into cities. And then the fourth factor, of course, is alien abduction. So if aliens were to selectively cull older people from cities, that would also reduce the age. I can't show the slides on that, but I'm going to say it's not a major factor. Okay, so let me show you which of those is actually going on. So looking at fertility in the United States has always been higher in rural areas, and it still is. The overall level of fertility changes over time, but it's not the case that there's been a fertility reversal. There's not a baby boom in US cities. So that's not the major factor. It could be mortality. If mortality were rising in cities, that would tend to lower the median age. But in fact, interestingly, cities used to have considerably higher mortality in the US, and now they actually have lower mortality. In fact, let me show you, adjusting for age, you can still really see it. So what's going on? Well, one obvious explanation is that US cities are a lot safer than they used to be. But that's probably not the main explanation. Probably the main explanation is that as cities have become much more educated, that's also had the effect of bringing in healthier people. Educated people tend to make healthier life choices, right? They are exercising more, eating more of the right foods, spending more time in the yoga studio, and making good decisions for themselves. So what this means is we don't have a differential rise in mortality in cities, so it's very unlikely that cities are getting younger because people are dying. So instead, it implies the third factor, which is population mobility, people moving around. And let me kind of show you that in some detail. So I'm going to show you these are net migration rates by age across places. And this first shows you people 0 to 17, so the youngest citizens. And you can see in all of these periods from 1970 to present, we see people 0 to 17 are moving out of dense areas and into high density, they're moving out of high density areas and into low density areas. Why are they doing that? Well, presumably their parents are looking for cheaper land, right? They're moving out of expensive places because they want to move to places where they can get a house with a larger house and more land and good schools at a lower price. So that hasn't changed. So that can't be the major explanation. Now, let's look at people to 18 to 24. So they actually tend to do just the opposite. So young college-age adults tend to move out of low-density areas and into higher-density areas, presumably to go to school. And that has gotten steeper over time as more people are going to college, but it hasn't dramatically changed. So now let's look at the next group, young prime-age adults, 25 to 39. What you see here is that their rate of movement out of cities has declined. And let me show you ages 40 to 54. These are older prime-age adults. And you again see this really dramatic change in terms of their rates of out-migration of cities. So what's going on? Well, it seems that, and that this is an interpretation, it's not a causal test, that people are moving for higher education. And then historically, so you could sort of think of this kind of three-part move. When they're still children, they're moving to the suburbs. Then once they reach college-going age, they move into denser places for higher education. And then historically, they would move back out again. But now they're not moving back out. They're staying in cities. Why are they staying in cities? Well, one, we know that wages have risen a lot for the highly educated in cities, right? So it's a better time to be, there's a good economic reason to be there. Second, we know that cities have gotten safer, right? Certainly US cities were, New York, Manhattan is, as far as we know, the safest it's ever been in sort of human history. And that definitely was not the case in 1990. So cities are safer. The food is much better than it used to be. I think that's an important draw. I have a teenager, and I know that his major form of recreation is going out for dinner with friends. And then the third, and then a final factor, of course, is people are having fewer kids, perhaps because they want to stay in cities. But having kids is an important reason to leave a city because you need more space, right? So all of those factors make cities a better place for the highly educated. Right? So what this says, just adding to this sort of fact base, right? Cities have become much more specialized, wages have risen for the highly educated, they become younger, and prime-age adults are tending to remain and lead their prime working years in cities in a way that they were not doing 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, so let me put this all together. This shows you net migration rates. So this is the total population movement across places in net. And you can see, again, in the 70s, people are moving out of dense areas. In the 80s, about the same. In the 1990s, they're moving to the suburbs. In 2000, they're moving less. By 2010, net migration has dramatically fallen. Right? So this says that people are tending to stay in place. That is often interpreted as a negative, as well, why are people stuck? Why aren't they moving to opportunity? But one possible interpretation is actually, they're moving to opportunity when they go to college and they're staying there. That's where the opportunity actually is. Okay, so that kind of tells you the story of how the changing nature of work has also changed the places where work occurs, the premium to being in those places, and then the set of people who are choosing to be there. So now in the final few minutes, I want to talk about the set of emerging jobs that we can sort of look forward to and think about and ask, how do those jobs compare to this same picture of polarization that I've been talking about, right? So I said work is polarized, the middle has contracted, the two ends have expanded. That's occurred differentially in cities. Well, what about the new work? Well, it's hard to measure new work. And so this part of the talk kind of draws on an earlier body of work by an economist named Jeff Lynn, who's from the Philadelphia Fed, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And he wrote a paper a few years ago where he had this very clever idea, which is that the US Census Bureau, since 1850, every decade has been producing a list of occupational titles. So they have a list of about 30,000 detailed titles. And where do those titles come from? Well, they ask people what they do, and they try to categorize those. And then if they ask people for these categories, and enough people mention a category they haven't heard before, they create a new title for that. And so Jeff said, well, we can sort of learn about new work by looking at the new titles that are added in every decade. And of course, this is not a complete measure of new work, right? New work occurs within jobs and so on, but it's interesting. It's indicative of one margin of adjustment, one margin of change. So when you think of new work, and clearly when Jeff Lynne thought about new work, I think most people sort of imagine the kind of high-tech frontier jobs, what we're going to call frontier jobs. These are the jobs that are, the jobs that involve using the new technology, right? So when you think of new work, you're thinking, botnet herder, neural network optimizer, artificial intellect, et cetera. And it is absolutely the case that many of the new titles that are created correspond to those categories. So let me show you some of them. This is by ongoing work with Anne Salomons of the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So here are some of the frontier jobs, as we call them, that were added to the US Census in 1980 through 2010. So in 1980, one of the frontier jobs would have been a supervisor of word processing. No longer a frontier job, clearly. But the frontier is always moving, right? There was a time when being the copier guy was the frontier job. Then in 1990s, it could have been a circuit design, layout designer, or robotic machine operator. In the 2000, artificial intelligence specialist. So you have to give the Census Bureau credit, right? They were talking about artificial intelligence before we were. Or a chief information officer, or a molecular physicist, or an intelligence analyst, and so on. So these are an important category of new work. And so whenever people say, well, what are the jobs of the future? I think these are the things that come to mind. But if you look at the list of occupations that are added, it becomes clear that there's another equally large category that has very little to do with technology. We call these jobs wealth work. These are jobs that primarily reflect services demanded by the affluent. And they have very little technological component. They're more a question of taste and income. So here's a list of some of those that were added by decade. So in 1980s, hypnotherapists, gift wrappers. There was also the mystery shopper, didn't make my list. Fingernail formers. In 2000, marriage counselors, baristas. Now, again, baristas were not invented in 2000. It's just that enough people in 2000 mentioned they were baristas that the Census Bureau created a new occupation title for it. Horse exercisers, the ever popular oyster preparer, and so on. Okay. And these are another important category. And right, a moment's reflection says, "Oh my God, those people are all over Melbourne," right? Okay, so this is an important feature of new work. All right. Finally, and let me say the last category, and this is much harder to measure, is what we call last mile jobs. These are jobs that are effectively the remaining husk of a once much more robust job that has been largely automated. Right. So a good example of that would be the Amazon warehouse worker. Right, so an Amazon warehouse worker 10 years ago was someone who would run through the building, right, in marathon clothes and climb up shelves and pull things down and run up to, and that it was a very physically demanding, intensive job. Now, an Amazon picker is a person who stands at a counter where robotic shelves drive up to them. A laser pointer on the ceiling points at the object on the shelf. The person picks it up, makes sure it is the right object, drops in a box, does the next one, right? And clearly, those jobs will not exist 15 years from now, right? It's the last mile because pretty soon, the rest of that job will be automated, right? So here are some other examples of last mile jobs by decade. Check writers, tamale machine feeders, vending machine attendants, inspectors of hand packaging, chat room hosts. Right? You could say that's a frontier job. It's also a last mile job. And in fact, often those kind of moderating jobs are not even done in the countries in which the services are performed. Right? They're done by workers on demand overseas in lower wage countries. So, well, why focus on these three categories? Well, it's interesting to compare them in terms of their earnings and locations, right? So if the average job in the US in 2015 paid about $19 an hour, 44% of those jobs were done by women, about a third by people with a college degree and so on. If we look at these frontier jobs, by our estimates in 2015, about 1 in 20 jobs fit into that category. They were paying substantially more per hour. 2/3 of them were done by men, and they're relatively well educated. If we look at the wealth work jobs, interestingly, those pay about the average wage of jobs in the economy. 2/3 of them are done by women. They're slightly more educated than the average, and they make up about 7% of jobs. So notably, right, there appears to be more wealth work than frontier work as we measure it. Finally, if we look at these last mile jobs, they are the least paid, the lowest paid. They're done about evenly by men and women, and they're much less educated. So just to show you in the last minute or two the geography of this, if we look across, if we look across places, what you can see is this frontier work, as you would expect, is growing most rapidly in the urban areas, right, in the dense places where work is highly educated. So, by the way, is wealth work, right? So this is a feature of affluent places, right? Where affluence is occurring, it's the same bifurcated work. On the one hand, people doing high-tech office jobs, and the other hand, people doing yoga studios, doing life coaching and tidying up coaching and so on. I'm sure the tidying up coach will be in the 2020 census set of occupational titles. Finally, this last mile work, because it doesn't have an in-person component, typically doesn't occur in cities, right? It occurs outside of cities, often outside of the country itself. And I should say, and this is an important and rather disheartening thing to note, a disproportionate share of the frontier work is done by men, and a disproportionate share of the wealth work is done by women. Okay, so I could also show you, but I'll just mention, this won't surprise you. Wage levels are very unequal across these categories. In the frontier work, those are high wage jobs, they're found in dense areas. The wealth work, it pays more in cities than outside of it, but it's not high wage work. And this last mile work, of course, is not very prevalent, and it's the lowest paying. So what you might take away from that, and I'll just put in the average worker for reference. So what you might take away from that is, when we think about what is the work of the future, well, there is no one type of job from the future. It's quite polarized in the way that current occupations are polarized. And so, if someone naively says to you, are we going to run out of jobs soon? Your answer should be no. We're not running out of jobs. There's lots of jobs being created, right? We have high employment throughout the developed world, and guess what? We're facing a demographic crunch. Right, we have very low fertility. We have lots of aging population. There's going to be tons and tons of work. So then, if they said to you, well, therefore, should I not be worried about anything? Then it's all good, and you should say, no, of course you should be worried. First, that's always true, right? You should always be worried. Just it's not clear what, right? There's a joke about well, okay, forget it. All right, so you probably don't want to hear old Jewish jokes. Okay, well, here it goes. So this husband goes overseas, and then he sends a cable back to his wife, and it says, "Start worrying. Details to follow." Okay. So should you be worried? Yes, you should be worried, but not about running out of jobs. What you should be concerned about is the bimodal structure of employment. There's never been more good jobs existing in advanced economies. The set of people who do creative, economically secure, highly rewarded, interesting work has never been larger. But those jobs require high levels of education. And increasingly, that's the majority of people. So education levels are rising in response. But there's a very large minority of people, at least 30 to 40%, maybe higher, who are moving in the opposite direction. Right? They're less and less in middle skill, stable, interesting work, in offices, in factories, and so on, doing work where they become more skilled and more productive and more central to their employer over time. And so as those jobs have gone away, those who do not have high levels of education are increasingly shunted into a narrower set of activities where the work is more generic, and even where the ladder of opportunity is less present, less steep in affluent places than it used to be. Okay, so let me wrap up. So just to summarize, I think there are kind of four big facts here. One is this macroeconomic fact, this polarization of occupational structure. And really that refers to the movement of non-college workers in traditionally low-paid work, into services, into hospitality, food, health, cleaning, security. The second is geography. This job polarization is not occurring uniformly everywhere. Instead, it reflects an unwinding of something that was distinctive and special about cities, which is that they had a different set of opportunities for people without specialized skills. They were doing more skilled work in direct proximity and jointly with the highly educated workers. And increasingly, that is not the case. And as that has eroded, the urban wage premium for non-college adults has also substantially slipped. In terms of population, young adults are following the incentives. They're following the money. The age gradient in population density is inverted, and young adults are moving to opportunity and staying there. New work is also very polarized, and a lot of it is urban, but it doesn't appear to be filling in that missing middle. If anything, it's just filling in the two extremes. So the challenges that I think are, really immediately jump away out of this is this concentrating opportunity in so-called superstar cities, right? So Australia in particular is extremely urbanized, so you see this around you, but doesn't appear to be spilling over to the less educated, right? And so that's a critical challenge. If we look outside of urban areas, the structure of employment, the structure of skills, the structure of wages, at least in the United States, hasn't changed very much. But what has changed, of course, is the population is getting much older. So that creates a different set of challenges and potentially a different set of opportunities. And so if you say, well, where is the work of the future? Well, it's a great time to be young and educated. So get a high level of education and choose a young age and stay that way. But it's not clear where the land of opportunity is for the less educated. And so when you think about the kind of economic and social and political schisms that are so visible in many advanced economies, I would hypothesize that many of them reflect this kind of pulling apart, right? That there's actually, arguably the majority of citizens are benefiting enormously from the dynamism, from the technological change, from the pure excitement of being in fast-growing places that are diverse, that are young, that are educated, that are exciting places to be. But there's a substantial minority who feels that their economic destiny, their horizon is actually getting narrower. The set of opportunities that are available to them are contracting, and the way forward is less visible. And so addressing that's a very hard problem, but if, by identifying it, hopefully we can think constructively about it. Okay, so thank you very, very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer a few questions if you'd like.
All right, thank you, David, for a great talk. It's fascinating. My name's David Harris. I'm the head of the economics department at Melbourne Uni, and we have some roving microphones. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and when the microphone reaches you, then we can ask. So we have one down the front here to start.
Thank you. John Leeper, Professor, and thank you very much. That was marvellous.
Thank you.
You talked about the nature of work and it changing. How does that relate to the gender structure of the economy and the fact that female education is improving, female participation rates are going up, and perhaps some of the male roles are changing, or maybe there's a third party to enable both parties to work more in the more normal or structured workforce?
Yeah, so absolutely. So, women have been artificially held back in their educational attainment for centuries. All the evidence suggests that, even 5 decades ago, 7 decades ago, women did better than their male classmates all the way through high school. And then the less prepared gender would go to college. And so what has changed in recent decades is, you could argue, the removal of those barriers had led to much more of the natural order of things, which is that women tend to be more educated. And they have adapted much more successfully to the occupational changes that have occurred. Women, if I were to draw those polarization plots by gender, you would see that the decline in the middle for women has almost entirely been offset by a movement into the professions. Whereas among men, the decline in the middle has been much more bifurcating. More men have moved into the professions, but more men have also moved into service occupations. I think it creates both opportunity and challenge. The big challenge is that it appears in many places that men are reluctant to do service work. So men who are not moving to the professions tend to have lower rates of participation, tend to disengage rather than do the work that's available. It's not that there are not jobs that men can do, but they seem less inclined to do them. And men have been reluctant, at least in many countries, to move into high-paying, skilled work that historically has been viewed as women's work, right? So nursing, right, is one of the great occupations, right? There's endless demand for nurses. It's a job where you can get a high rate of pay and you can move around, portable skill, and it requires substantial education, but not more education than a bachelor's degree. And men have been very reluctant to move into that. So I think it's a real challenge. And I think that's another set of tensions that we see, that as the economy has shifted, it has the set of a lot of high status jobs for less educated men have gone away rapidly, and men have not adapted as successfully to that. It still ironically is the case that in the highest paid jobs and the most specialized jobs, men still are vastly overrepresented. So I think this presents challenges and opportunity. These things will change over time, but how fast they change and how we kind of push them in the right direction is a much harder question that I don't know the answer to.
Hi, David. My name's Tim Griffin. Big fan. I did my honours thesis based off some of your work, now working for the government. I guess I would like to ask how you would like your work reflected in public policy, specifically around education or labour market kind of policy.
Good. Oh, thanks very much for the question. I guess I would say that I think it's non-controversial at this point to say we should be improving the quality of education both at the K through 12 level. We should be investing in skilled vocational work, and we should be sending people to university. So I'm not going to say that. I mean, I did, but I'm not. I think that the challenge, a more concrete and immediate challenge, is how do we restore the quality of opportunity for people who don't have high levels of education? What is the escalator they can ride into the middle class? And that's not an easy problem, but I don't think it's totally impossible. And you can see, let me give you an example from the US. There's increasingly people employed as home health workers. They go out to your house and they take care of your immediate care needs. But because of occupational licensing, they can't give you a shot, they can't give you a pill, they can't help you with your taking your insulin. They're really limited in the work they can do. And that's a huge loss on many dimensions. One, of course, it raises costs. Two, it erodes the quality of care. And three, it prevents people from doing more specialized work that would pay better, right? And the reason that I want to choose that example is because there's lots of people doing that work, and there are going to be more people doing that work going forward. So that's an opportunity to take what is currently a non-specialized service occupation and increase the set of tasks that people can do, therefore increase their productivity, the wage levels they can command, and that's going to be beneficial for all kinds of people. So looking for opportunities to take people who don't have high levels of formal education and move them into a trajectory, not where they can get employed. Most people can get employed at this point, but into a job that will have rising wages over the career and increasing stability. That is, I think, a really important goal.
Just continuing on from similar idea, what are your thoughts on place and viability of universal basic income in the United States?
Wait, on place? Okay.
If it has a place in the...
Okay. So I'm not a fan of universal basic income. And you can all boo if you like. I'm a huge fan of a social safety net. And a social safety net can take many forms, right? It can take guaranteed education, health care, access to food. But I feel like if we're gonna, a universal basic income is extremely expensive, right? It requires a huge amount of taxing and transferring. If I had that much money at my disposal for social service programs, I would do more to improve the quality of work for people with low levels of education, low levels of earnings, rather than make it easier for people to choose not to work. And that's because this reflects my own, very traditional views that work is a good. That work is not simply about earning income. Work gives people structure, gives them identity. And people don't function very well without those things. Work is productive in many ways. So I would rather I'm absolutely in favor of achieving the same level of economic security that could be achieved through universal basic income, but I would rather use those resources to make work pay rather than make leisure pay.
I think you've probably outlined some evidence that shows that people are moving to cities and kind of staying there a lot more. I appreciate that in America that there's a lot more sort of smaller, rural, lower density cities that in Australia. And Australia, a lot more people live in the larger cities. Having said that, I guess my key question is kind of, what do you see in the future as being the role for like smaller country or rural, low density cities, especially over here where they're really, really small and don't really drive any scale?
Yeah, so I think it's a challenging question. So first let me say, it could be, I basically, though, I didn't use the word, but we see growing agglomeration, right? Like the importance of being all in the same place. People are just like, it's just a black hole. And that we could de-agglomerate, right? It's possible that technology will improve enough that people will decide they actually don't really need to be physically where they work. I'm not so sure that's going to happen quickly. Even if you say, look, I have a huge monitor on my wall and a great camera so I can interact with anyone, it's just like being there, you're not going to have a chance encounter with someone on your wall monitor, right? You're not going to run into them unless you invite them. So it's not clear that that's going to work perfectly. I think that the challenge, so there's nothing intrinsically problematic about urbanization. In fact, it's a much more eco-conscious way to live, right? If we just move in and destroy a few places like very intensively and leave the rest of the world alone. But I think the challenge comes that it's not that everyone moves, right? Is that there are places that are left behind. And certainly if you look around the US, we have a bunch of superstar cities and then a lot of downwardly mobile places. And the challenge for us, and I don't know if this is really a challenge for you, is how we re-inject prosperity back into those places. And there's no simple, I've said that about 14 times, but it's still true. I don't know the answer, but there's my forthcoming book by my colleagues John Gruber and Simon Johnson called Jumpstarting America. And their point, the idea that they put forward is, there are kind of two major ways that, maybe three, that federal governments sort of invest in places. One is they, build military bases. A second is that they build universities. And a third is that they build hospitals. But those have very different effects on the economy of a place, right? So military bases are pretty self-contained. Universities are virtuous in many ways, right? They stay young. Right? You have a very stable age structure. They create ideas, so there tends to be a lot of entrepreneurialism. They breed diversity. They bring people in from around the world. And they create tremendous demand for culture and food and entertainment and all kinds of things. So if you look in many countries, in many places, you'll find that where a university is, a town exists that would not otherwise be there, that is a kind of a dynamic, healthy place. Hospitals bring lots of money into places, and obviously you need hospitals for people, but they don't create the same virtuous dynamic. So their argument is that federal governments should be trying to move the educational infrastructure and research infrastructure out into many more places rather than letting it concentrate in just a few. That's not a complete solution, but that gets you maybe a small part of the way there. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, one more. Down the frontier. Yeah.
David, thank you for coming out to Australia, and thank you for your presentation. One of the debates that we have here in Australia is, why has our average weekly earnings not grown? Why have we had a period of low labour productivity or low productivity increase? If I take what you've presented today, part of the answer may exist in what you've presented. What are your thoughts on that?
So the sort of slowing productivity in the industrialized world is not well understood. It is something that we see across wealthy economies. It's especially over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's quite puzzling, especially because we perceive ourselves to be in a time of very rapid technological progress. A couple of thoughts on this. One is part of the reason that people don't see living standards rising as fast as technology seems to be changing is that labor's share of national income is declining in many wealthy countries. So the pie is getting bigger, but labor's slice of the pie is contracting. And so a lot of the growth accrues in the form of profits or ownership stakes rather than labor payments. So that's one factor, and that may have to do with the way with sort of superstar firms and the kind of growth of a fringe of highly productive, less labor-intensive firms. The other is that although there's lots of technological progress at present, it's not clear how fundamental it is at the moment. Many of the things that we do are less transformative. They're cool, right? There's lots of cool technology, but it's not necessarily transformative in the way that aircraft or indoor plumbing or electrification were. But it's quite likely, I think many people would find this logical, that there's a kind of an overhang of great technologies that we haven't figured out how to use yet. And that over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, we will figure out what they're for. Right? So, and just to give you one example, not to tax your patience too much longer, but the global positioning system was developed by the U.S. military, and it was in place in the 1960s, I believe, and robustly so later on. It was not available to for non-military uses until in 1986, the Korean Airline 007 aircraft accidentally flew over Russian airspace and was shot down. And at that point, President Reagan said, we're going to open up GPS. Everyone can use it. Well, your life didn't change the next day, right? GPS did not affect you. It took decades for people to figure out what else GPS could be used for. It had to be incorporated into maps. It had to be miniaturized. It's now in your phone. Now, every app that you open uses your GPS, probably unbeknownst to you and not for a good purpose. But the point is, it took actually decades to figure out what to do with the technology that was, already ready to go at that moment. So the process of technological transformation is much slower than the process of invention. Inventions occur, but then it takes people often decades to figure out how to use them productively. So I think we are arguably in a period where we have the GPS, right? We have the first wave, it's out there, we have artificial intelligence, we're getting robotics, we have these incredible communication technologies, but we haven't figured out how to use them as well as we eventually will to improve the quality of healthcare, to improve the quality of education, right? To improve our transportation networks. All those things, I think, are things that we can aspire to and potentially look forward to. Okay, well, thank you very, very much for your questions. Thank you for inviting me.